There was no warning. One moment, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was scanning the cold, empty skies over western Germany, his hand resting lightly on the controls of his P-47 Thunderbolt. The next, his world disintegrated into a hell of shattered glass and shrieking metal. A blinding flash, followed by a deafening roar, ripped through his cockpit. The instrument panel, his only guide in the vast, hostile blue, exploded into 1,000 pieces of shrapnel. A wave of searing heat washed over him, and the acrid smell of burning oil and electrical wiring filled his lungs. He was blind. Pain, sharp and immediate, shot through his body. It felt as if a hammer had struck his face. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but all he could see was a blurry, swimming haze of red. His own blood was mixing with the hydraulic fluid, spraying from ruptured lines, covering his goggles and streaming down his face. He could feel the warmth of it, a terrifyingly intimate sensation. The canopy above him was a spiderweb of cracks, the thick armored glass crazed, but miraculously, not completely gone. Through the fractures, he could glimpse the impossible. More than a dozen German Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, the infamous butcher birds, swarming his aircraft like sharks in a feeding frenzy. He was alone, separated from his squadron, and caught in the deadliest trap a pilot could imagine. His P-47, a machine he and his fellow pilots had nicknamed the Jug, with a mixture of affection and derision, shuddered violently. Another volley of cannon shells slammed into its fuselage. The sound was not a clean puncture, but a brutal, percussive pounding, like a sledgehammer against an anvil. He felt the impacts in his bones, each one a death sentence delayed. The controls in his hands went slack for a moment, then fought against him as the plane threatened to spiral out of control. Fire, bright and hungry, began to lick at the edges of his engine cowling. A trail of thick, black smoke now marked his path. Across the sky, a funeral pyre in motion. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold. Every instinct screamed at him to bail out, to escape the burning, crippled beast that was now his coffin. He reached for the canopy release handle, his heart pounding in his throat. He pulled. Nothing. He threw his shoulder against it, using every ounce of his strength. The canopy was jammed, twisted, and fused shut by the force of the cannon strikes. He was trapped. The fire was growing, the smoke thickening. This was it. This was how it ended. He was 22 years old, thousands of feet above a land that wanted him dead, inside a 7-ton tomb of his own country's making. But then, through the smoke and the haze of his own blood, something extraordinary happened. A Focke-Wulf 190, its yellow nose cone, marking it as a seasoned fighter from a premier squadron, pulled up alongside him. It was so close he could see the pilot in the cockpit, a faceless figure behind a mask and goggles, staring directly at him. Johnson braced for the final, merciful kill shot. The German pilot had him dead to rights. A short burst from his powerful 20mm cannons would be enough to tear the wing off the Thunderbolt and send him plummeting to the earth. The moment stretched into an eternity. Instead of firing, the German pilot did something that defied all logic of warfare. He gently, almost gracefully, rocked his wings from side to side, a universal signal among aviators. It was a salute, a gesture of respect. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he peeled away and vanished, leaving Johnson alone in his shattered cockpit, grappling with a profound and dizzying mystery. Why? Why would an enemy, in the midst of a slaughter, spare him? Why would he offer a sign of honor to a man he had just tried to kill? The more pressing question, however, was the one Johnson himself could barely comprehend as he wrestled his dying machine back towards friendly lines. He was partially blinded. His plane was riddled with what he would later learn were 21 direct hits from 20mm, cannon shells, and hundreds of smaller caliber machine gun rounds. His hydraulic systems were gone, his engine was on fire, and his flight controls were barely responsive. And yet, somehow, impossibly, he was still in the air. The Thunderbolt, this lumbering, overweight giant that so many pilots had scorned, was refusing to die. It absorbed a level of punishment that should have disintegrated any other fighter plane in existence, and it continued to fly. This single event was more than just a remarkable story of one man's survival. It was a turning point. It was the moment a deeply held belief system began to crumble. For the aces of the German Luftwaffe, warriors who revered speed, agility, and elegant, lightweight design, this American anomaly was an insult to their very philosophy of air combat. They were artists of the sky, masters of the intricate dance of energy fighting, and their machines, the Bf-109 and FW-190, were their finely tuned instruments. In their eyes, American engineering was brutish, unsophisticated, and wasteful, a reflection of a culture that valued mass production over craftsmanship. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the ultimate embodiment of this flawed ideology. It was a juggernaut, a flying tank. It was, by all their metrics, a terrible fighter plane. Yet, there was the undeniable evidence. Men like Robert Johnson were returning to their bases in machines that looked like scrap metal, machines that had no right to be airborne. And as they returned, the German pilots were left in their cockpits, staring at empty skies and dwindling ammunition, haunted by a single, maddening question. It was a question that echoed in after-action reports, in the frustrated debriefings with their commanders, and in the quiet, doubtful moments between missions. It was the question that would come to define the air war in the West. A question born from the sight of this unkillable American beast, absorbing everything they threw at it and still stubbornly flying on. Why doesn't it fall? This wasn't just about a single pilot's luck. This was about a clash of worlds, a war of ideas fought not in textbooks, but in fire and steel, 10,000 feet in the air. And the answer would ultimately determine who ruled the skies over Europe. To understand the German pilots' profound confusion, one must first understand the machine that caused it. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was, in every sense of the word, a giant. When it first began arriving at American air bases in England in late 1942, the prevailing reaction among pilots and even the ground crews was a mix of awe and outright disbelief. Standing next to the sleek, agile British Spitfire, the P-47 looked less like a thoroughbred racehorse and more like a draft horse, a brute bred for hauling, not for fighting. Pilots joked that in the event of an air raid, the safest place on the airfield was to take cover behind the Thunderbolt. Everything about it was excessive. Its empty weight, without a single bullet or drop of fuel, was nearly 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded for combat, it tipped the scales at over 17,500 pounds, or nearly 9 tons. For context, the Germans' formidable Focke-Wulf 190, a plane celebrated for its power, weighed in at a comparatively nimble 8,500 pounds fully loaded. The American P-51 Mustang, which would later become a legend in its own right, was a featherweight by comparison. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter plane. It was an aviation anomaly. Its very existence seemed to defy the established principles of aerial combat, which for decades had been built on a sacred trinity: speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. In these crucial categories, the early models of the P-47 were tragically, almost comically, deficient. Its initial rate of climb was sluggish, leaving its pilots vulnerable to the German tactic of boom and zoom, where enemy fighters could dive from above, make a firing pass, and then use their superior energy retention to climb away with impunity. In a turning dogfight, the classic test of a fighter's agility, the Thunderbolt was a disaster. It couldn't outturn a Bf-109 or an FW-190. Trying to do so was a form of suicide. Many American pilots, trained in the nimble fighters of the pre-war era, felt they were being sent into combat in a flying brick. They felt like heavyweight boxers being asked to compete in a fencing match. Their initial reports back to headquarters were filled with frustration and a palpable sense of dread. They had been given a pickup truck and told to go race against Ferraris. This initial perception wasn't just a matter of pilot opinion. It was rooted in two fundamentally opposed design philosophies, two different ways of looking at the very nature of warfare. European aircraft design, born from the crucible of two world wars fought on its own soil, was a discipline of optimization and elegance. Resources were scarce. Every ounce of weight, every drop of fuel, had to be justified. The result was aircraft like the Spitfire and the Bf 109 masterpieces of engineering efficiency, designed to extract the absolute maximum performance from the lightest possible airframe. They were scalpels, honed to a razor's edge, deadly and precise, but also fragile. They operated on the principle that the best way to survive a fight was to be so fast and agile that you never got hit in the first place. The American approach, as embodied by the P-47, was entirely different. It was a philosophy born not of scarcity, but of abundance. It was the product of a vast industrial engine, a nation separated from the immediate conflict by two oceans, with access to seemingly limitless resources. American engineering didn't ask, "What's the most efficient way to do this?" It asked, "What's the most robust, most durable, most over-engineered way we can possibly build this, and then how do we make it fly?" The P-47 was the physical manifestation of that mindset. The reason it was so heavy was because it was built around the largest, most powerful piston engine of the war, the 2,000 horsepower, Pratt and Whitney R. 2,800 double wasp, and then surrounded by the thickest, strongest airframe imaginable, where a European designer would use a single, lightweight spar in the wing. The American designers would use two and make them thicker. Where a German plane might have a small, strategically placed piece of armor to protect the pilot, the Thunderbolt was built with a veritable cocoon of steel plating. This wasn't just a design choice. It was a cultural statement. It was a declaration that the life of the pilot was worth the extra 1,000 pounds of steel. It was a belief that in a war of attrition, the side that could bring its experienced fighters home to fight another day would ultimately win. The plane itself was, in a way, considered expendable. The trained pilot inside it was not. This philosophy of survivability over performance was a radical departure from the norm. It was a concept so alien to the Luftwaffe's way of thinking that they initially failed to grasp its strategic implications. They saw the P-47's weaknesses, its poor turn rate, its slow acceleration at low altitudes, and they built their entire tactical doctrine around exploiting them. They saw a clumsy giant, an easy target. What they failed to see was that the very things they perceived as flaws were in fact the source of the Thunderbolt's terrifying resilience. The immense weight was armor. The sluggishness was a byproduct of a structure that could absorb unimaginable punishment. They were trying to knock down a wall by punching it, not realizing the wall was made of solid granite. This misunderstanding would prove to be one of Germany's most fatal errors in the air war. They were prepared for an enemy that played by their rules. They were not prepared for an enemy that simply refused to be knocked out of the sky. But how could one aircraft, born from such a seemingly backward philosophy, go on to become the single greatest nemesis of Germany's elite fighter pilots? How could a machine dismissed as a liability from the factory systematically dismantle the most feared air force the world had ever seen? The answer wasn't found in its performance charts or its technical specifications. It was found in the mind of the man who designed it, a quiet immigrant who saw the airplane not just as a weapon, but as a promise to bring its pilot home. The soul of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the answer to the Germans' frustrated question, was not forged in the sprawling factories of Long Island. It was born in the mind of one man, Alexander Kartveli. To the public, he was a ghost, an unknown name behind the roaring engines and headlines of aerial victories. But within the halls of Republic aviation, he was a quiet titan, a chief engineer whose vision was as radical as it was revolutionary. And to understand his masterpiece, you must first understand him. Kartveli was not born in the land of industrial plenty. He was a product of the old world's chaos, an immigrant from Tbilisi, Georgia, who had fled his homeland during the Bolshevik Revolution. He had seen firsthand the fragility of nations, of armies, of men. He had witnessed how elegant theories and sophisticated machines could be shattered in an instant by the brutal realities of war. This experience imbued him with a perspective that was fundamentally different from that of his American or European counterparts. When he looked at a fighter plane, he didn't just see a collection of aerodynamic surfaces and mechanical parts. He saw a system, and at the heart of that system was its most valuable, most complex, and most irreplaceable component, the human pilot. In an era where many designers still viewed pilots as little more than operators, Kartveli saw them as the very purpose of the machine. The American war machine, he reasoned, could produce airplanes by the tens of thousands. They were replaceable. But an experienced combat pilot, a man who had survived a dozen missions, who had learned the deadly calculus of the skies, was a treasure beyond price. He was an investment of time, training, and battlefield wisdom that could not be simply manufactured. From this core belief, a radical design philosophy emerged. The primary mission of a fighter aircraft, Kartveli declared, was not merely to engage and destroy the enemy. Its most crucial function was to bring its pilot home safely so that he could fight again. Every decision he made, every pound of weight he added, every choice that seemed to defy the conventional wisdom of aerial combat, flowed from this single, unwavering principle. It was a philosophy of life-saving engineering. His gamble was audacious. He was willing to sacrifice the nimble performance that pilots craved for the rugged durability that he knew they would need. The execution of this philosophy began with the heart of the beast. Kartveli chose the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, not just for its immense 2,000 horsepower, but for a characteristic the Germans fatally underestimated. It was air-cooled. The sleek, high-performance engines in the Bf-109, the Spitfire, and the Mustang were liquid-cooled. They were marvels of engineering, but they possessed a critical vulnerability. A single, lucky shot from a machine gun, piercing a coolant line or radiator, could cause the engine to overheat and seize within minutes, dooming the pilot. Kartveli's chosen engine was a different animal entirely. It was a massive, 18-cylinder radial engine, a brute that cooled itself with the rushing air. It had no fragile network of pipes and pumps to protect. Its cylinders could be punctured, shot through, and damaged, and the engine would often continue to thunder along, pulling its pilot out of harm's way. It was a brute force solution to the delicate problem of survival. Then, Kartveli built a fortress around the pilot. Where other designers placed a single plate of armor behind the seat, Kartveli constructed what pilots would come to call the armored bathtub. It was a sanctuary of thick steel plating that wrapped around the cockpit, protecting the pilot from the sides, below, and behind. He then added a sheet of thick, armored glass to the front windscreen. This wasn't just protection. It was a statement of intent. It was Kartveli drawing a line in the sky and telling the enemy, "Everything else on this plane can be hit, but you will not touch the man inside." He extended this life-saving obsession to the fuel tanks. A fire in the fuel system was one of the most terrifying ways for a pilot to die. Kartveli implemented a self-sealing fuel tank system that was unprecedented in its effectiveness. The tanks were lined with layers of rubber and sealant. When a bullet or shell fragment pierced the tank, the fuel would cause the inner rubber layers to swell, instantly plugging the hole and preventing the catastrophic leaks that so often led to explosions. In essence, he gave the Thunderbolt a living, healing skin, allowing it to absorb wounds that would have been fatal to its more fragile adversaries. The entire airframe was a testament to this principle of over-engineering. The main wing spar wasn't a single beam. It was a massive, reinforced structure so strong that ground crews joked you could saw half a wing off and the other half would still carry the plane home, and in some documented cases, they weren't far from the truth. Control surfaces were linked with redundant, heavy-duty cables, ensuring that even if one was severed by enemy fire, the pilot still had a fighting chance to maintain control. The plane was built less like a delicate instrument and more like a suspension bridge, designed to retain its integrity even when significant parts of its structure were compromised or missing entirely. This philosophy was, to put it mildly, controversial. Test pilots complained about the weight. Seasoned commanders, steeped in the traditional doctrines of dogfighting, questioned its tactical viability. It was an insult to the art of aerial combat. But Kartveli held his ground, staking his reputation on his belief that, in the brutal war of attrition over Europe, the victor would not be the fighter with the best turn rate, but the one with the best survival rate. And then, the proof began to fly home. It came in the form of shattered, mangled, and barely recognizable P-47 seconds staggering back to their airfields in England. They returned with entire cylinders, shot off their engines, with tails that looked like Swiss cheese, with gaping cannon holes in their wings and fuselages. They returned when, by all logic, they should have been nothing more than a smoking crater in a German field. And from these ruined machines, pilots would climb out shaken, sometimes wounded, but alive. Each one of these miraculous returns was a vindication of Kartveli's insane gamble. Every pilot who walked away from a wreck that should have been his grave was a living testament to the immigrant's philosophy. It was a lesson being written in bent steel and leaking oil. The fight is not over until the pilot is down. And getting a P-47 pilot down was proving to be one of the hardest jobs in the world. Kartveli had done more than design a durable airplane. He had unknowingly forged a new psychological weapon. What happens when you give an ordinary soldier the unshakable belief that his equipment can make him survive the unsurvivable? You create a new, and far more dangerous, breed of warrior. The physical survival of the P-47 was a marvel of engineering, but its most profound impact was not on metal, but on the minds of the men who flew it. War is a psychological battle as much as a physical one, and what happened inside the cockpits of the 56th Fighter Group, and others like it, was a transformation that the German High Command had never anticipated. Kartveli's life-saving philosophy had an unintended, but devastatingly effective side effect. It forged a new kind of warrior, one who flew with a sense of near invincibility that bordered on arrogance. Imagine the mindset. Flying a British Spitfire or an American P-51 Mustang was like wielding a rapier. It was a weapon of finesse, of precision, rewarding a pilot's delicate touch and mastery of angles. A dogfight was a deadly ballet. But flying the P-47 Thunderbolt was like swinging a sledgehammer. There was little finesse required. It was a weapon of brute force, of overwhelming power, and it rewarded aggression. The pilots who first flew the Jug into combat did so with trepidation, acutely aware of its shortcomings in a turning fight. But as they witnessed their comrades returning from missions with damage that defied belief, that fear began to curdle into something else entirely. It became confidence, and that confidence became a weapon. This psychological shift was institutionalized by men like Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, the legendary leader of the 56th Fighter Group, famously known as Zemke's Wolfpack. Zemke was a brilliant, pragmatic commander who understood that you don't fight a duel with a sledgehammer. You use it to smash things. He and other leaders like him throughout the old rulebook. They developed tactics that played not to the Thunderbolt's non-existent agility, but to its incredible strengths. Its raw power, its devastating firepower from 8 50 caliber machine guns, its phenomenal dive speed, and above all, its obscene toughness. The Thunderbolt pilots stopped trying to dance with the Fu 190 seconds. Instead, they began to brawl. Their new doctrine was one of raw, unadulterated aggression. They would use their plane's weight to plummet from high altitudes at speeds approaching the sound barrier, a terrifying spectacle for any pilot below. A German ace, executing a perfect turn, would suddenly find his sky filled with a 9-ton American, a monster screaming downhill, its 8 guns spewing a torrent of fire that could literally saw an enemy plane in half. And the American pilots knew that even if they took hits during this head-on, high-speed pass, their plane could absorb the punishment. They could fly through an enemy formation, a tactic that was unthinkable in any other Allied fighter, and emerge on the other side, ready to climb and do it all over again. This created a palpable tension within the Allied command structure itself. Many pilots, especially those with experience in more nimble aircraft, still lobbied for fighters that could mix it up in a classic dogfight. The strategic value of the Thunderbolt was a topic of fierce debate. In briefing rooms across England, a young, eager pilot might complain, "Sir, we can't stay and turn with them. If we get into a furball, we're sitting ducks." But an older, more seasoned commander, or perhaps a pilot who had just returned in a battered jug, would counter with the cold, hard truth. "Maybe so," he'd say, pointing to a P-47 on the runway with its tail looking like a piece of lace. "But Lieutenant Smith came home yesterday with half a rudder. The Luftwaffe threw 3 fighters at him, and he still came home." How many Spitfire pilots do you know who can say that? That was the crux of the matter. The P-47 was becoming a machine for creating veterans. In the brutal calculus of a war of attrition, this was the single most important factor. An air force is only as good as its experienced pilots. A rookie, no matter how talented, is prone to making fatal mistakes. A pilot on his 20th mission has a combat awareness that cannot be taught in a classroom. Germany's strategy, particularly on the Eastern Front, had produced some of the highest-scoring aces in history, but it came at the cost of burning out their pilots and suffering unsustainable losses among the less experienced. The P-47 reversed this equation for the Americans. It gave green pilots a chance to survive their first crucial missions. It allowed them to make mistakes, to get hit, and to learn from the experience rather than die from it. It was a combat university with the highest graduation rate in the sky. This unshakable confidence, this knowledge that their machine was a fortress, fundamentally altered the pilots' risk assessment. They would engage in situations that other pilots would flee from. They would escort bombers deeper into enemy territory, relentlessly pursuing German fighters long after they should have turned back. They became the ultimate guardians of the bomber streams, precisely because the German pilots learned a terrible lesson. Attacking a bomber formation escorted by Thunderbolts was a uniquely unpleasant experience. The American pilots would not be drawn away. They would not be easily scared off. They would place their flying tanks between the bombers and the attackers, absorbing the cannon fire and refusing to give ground. This new American warrior, emboldened by his seemingly indestructible steed, was a psychological nightmare for the Luftwaffe. German pilots were trained to be hunters, to seek out weakness and exploit it with surgical precision. But how do you fight an enemy who doesn't seem to care if you hit him? How do you demoralize a pilot who believes his airplane will bring him home no matter what you do to it? It was like fighting an opponent who simply wouldn't flinch. The confidence of the American P-47 pilot became a tangible, oppressive force in the air, as real as the streams of 50 caliber bullets. But to truly understand the soul-crushing impact of this new reality, we must leave the relative safety of the Allied briefing rooms and cross the lines. We must climb into the cockpit of Germany's greatest aces to see this American monster not as a savior, but as the harbinger of their doom. To the men of the Luftwaffe, the sky was a realm of cold, hard physics. It was a chessboard governed by immutable laws of energy, speed, and geometry. They were its grandmasters. A pilot's skill, combined with the superior performance of his Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, was a formula for victory that had been proven over Poland, France, and the vast plains of Russia. Then, the Thunderbolt arrived, and the equation no longer made sense. The chessboard had been flipped over by a brutish opponent who didn't seem to know the rules, yet was somehow winning the game. Picture this. You are an Oberleutnant in the Jagdgeschwader 26. You are a veteran of 100 combat missions. An ace with a dozen victories painted on your rudder. You are flying the FIDF W190, a machine you consider to be the finest piston engine fighter in the world. You spot a lone American P-47 below, lumbering along like a lost cow. It is the perfect setup. You dive from the sun, your advantage in altitude converting to blistering speed. The American pilot doesn't see you until it's too late. You line him up in your sights, your hands steady, your calculations precise. You open fire. The satisfying thud of your 20mm cannon shells hitting home reverberates through your airframe. You see the impact's clearly bright flashes along the wing root and fuselage. Pieces of metal flake off the American plane. A thick plume of black smoke erupts from its engine. A kill. By every rule you have ever learned. By every dogfight you have ever won. This is a dead aircraft. The pilot should be bailing out, or the plane should be entering its death spiral. But it doesn't. The smoke continues to pour, but the Thunderbolt flies on, stubbornly maintaining its course and altitude. It doesn't even seem to slow down. Annoyed, you sweep around for another pass. This time you get closer. So close you can see the rivets on its oversized body. You riddle its tail surfaces with machine gun fire and land another cannon shell squarely in its engine cowling. More smoke, more damage, and still, it flies. Now, your annoyance turns to disbelief. You make a third pass, a fourth. You empty your remaining ammunition into the stubborn American beast. You have hit it with enough firepower to down an entire squadron of Spitfires, and it simply refuses to fall. As you peel away, your guns silent and your fuel gauge dropping, you watch in a state of utter professional bewilderment as the smoking, mangled P-47 continues its journey home, a flying ghost that has defied the very laws of your world. This was the experience that broke the spirit of some of Germany's finest pilots. Günther Rahl, the third highest scoring ace in history, with 275 victories, would later recall his transfer to the Western Front with a shudder. After fighting the comparatively fragile aircraft of the Soviet Air Force, his first encounter with the P-47 was a profound shock. They were very, very strong, he said, the memory still vivid decades later. You could hit them, and they were damn tough. I saw my 20mm cannon shells bouncing off the fuselage of a P-47. It was unbelievable. For a man like Rahl, who could calculate the precise burst of fire needed to dispatch an enemy, the Thunderbolt was an infuriating, illogical anomaly. This sentiment echoed up and down the ranks of the Luftwaffe. Johannes Steinhoff, another high-scoring ace and future general, spoke of the P-47 with a mixture of hatred and grudging admiration. He described how his pilots would return from missions, white-faced and furious, their voices shaking with frustration in the debriefing rooms. "We have shot him. He was burning. I saw the hits, and he did not go down." It was a recurring nightmare. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a durable machine. It was a psychological weapon that eroded the very foundation of a German pilot's confidence. His skill. What good was being a master marksman if your target simply absorbed the bullets like a sponge? What good was your superior aircraft if the enemy's could be mortally wounded and still carry its pilot home? The problem was a fundamental clash of perceptions. The Germans saw the P-47 as a poorly designed fighter because it couldn't dogfight. The Americans, however, weren't using it as a dogfighter. They were using it as an airborne battering ram, an escort battleship. Its job wasn't to dance, but to smash. This refusal to fight on German terms was deeply unsettling. It felt like cheating. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with over 200 victories, once furiously lamented that the American pilots were indecently careless of their lives, throwing their planes into head-on attacks that no sane European pilot would consider. He failed to grasp that this wasn't carelessness. It was a supreme confidence, born from the knowledge that in a head-on pass between an FW-190 and a P-47, the German plane was a glass cannon, while the American plane was a bank vault. This growing dread had a corrosive effect on Luftwaffe morale. It forced them to expend more and more ammunition on a single target, depleting their resources and leaving them vulnerable. It made them hesitant, questioning their own eyes when they saw an enemy plane smoking. Was it truly going down, or was it just another one of those things? This hesitation, this momentary doubt in the critical seconds of combat, was a death sentence. The constant reports of these unkillable fighters flowing back to headquarters created a crisis for the German high command. Their aces, the very backbone of their air defense, were being worn down not by superior pilots or superior aircraft in the traditional sense, but by an enemy that simply wouldn't break. Their logic had failed them. Their doctrine was becoming obsolete. In the face of this indestructible American machine, the Luftwaffe leadership was forced to consider a desperate and unprecedented change in tactics. If their best pilots, in their best planes, could no longer reliably shoot down the American escorts, then perhaps the only solution was to stop trying. It was a thought born of pure desperation, a strategic gamble that would soon have catastrophic consequences for the Third Reich. The question, "Why won't it fall?" was no longer a pilot's frustrated curse. It was now a strategic problem that demanded a solution. And the one they chose would play directly into American hands. Faced with a crisis of morale and a tactical puzzle they could not solve, the German High Command made a decision born of pure desperation. It was a strategic pivot that, on paper, seemed like their last, best hope. In reality, it was the single greatest mistake they would make in the air war over the West. The order came down from the very top, from men like General of the Fighters Adolf Galland. Ignore the escorts. Concentrate all attacks on the bombers. The logic behind this command was brutal and simple. The American daylight bombing campaign was bleeding Germany's industrial heart dry. If the Luftwaffe could inflict such catastrophic losses on the four-engine bombers, the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, then the Americans would be forced to abandon their strategy. The war of production could be won. In this grim calculation, the P-47 Thunderbolts were to be treated as a mere nuisance, a secondary threat to be bypassed in the all-out assault on the true prize. The German pilots were now ordered to fly directly through the American fighter screens. It was a suicide mission in all but name, and they knew it. They were to endure the attacks from the Thunderbolts, absorb the losses, and press on at all costs to reach the lumbering fat cats. This decision was a fundamental misunderstanding of American strategy and the very nature of the weapon they were choosing to ignore. The P-47 wasn't just an escort. It was the perfect escort. Its entire reason for being, the core of Kartvel's philosophy, was to be a guardian, a flying shield. The German command had just handed the American pilots the exact scenario their aircraft had been built for. They had walked, eyes wide open, into a perfectly laid trap. The results were apocalyptic. The skies over Germany turned into a slaughterhouse. Imagine the scene. A wave of German fighters, for 190 seconds, and Bf, 109 seconds, diving headlong towards a combat box of B-17 flying fortresses. To reach the bombers, they first had to fly through a gauntlet of defensive fire from the bombers themselves, a crisscrossing web of hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns. As they fixated on their targets, braving this storm of lead, they became completely vulnerable. They had to ignore the wolves circling above, and the wolves descended. The P-47 pilots, now freed from the task of engaging in complex dogfights, were unleashed in their purest form, as predators. Their mission was no longer simply to screen and protect, it was to annihilate. The call would go out over the radio. Bandits at 6 o'clock, diving for the bombers, and Zemke's Wolfpack, or any of the other battle-hardened Thunderbolt groups, would roll over and plummet down, their massive radial engines screaming in a full-power dive. The German pilots, their attention locked on the bombers ahead, would be ripped apart from behind, often without even knowing what hit them. The P-47 seconds didn't need to outturn them. They just needed to point their noses down and let gravity and their 8 guns do the work. The kill ratios, which had already been tipping in the Americans' favor, became grotesquely one-sided. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging its most experienced pilots in these futile attacks. They were trading their irreplaceable aces for damage to bombers that, more often than not, still managed to limp back to England. Protected by the very escorts the Germans were ignoring, the P-47 had effectively broken the back of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm over the Western Front. The clumsy giant had become the undisputed king of the skies, not by being a better duelist, but by being a better bodyguard. With the threat from German fighters largely neutralized by late 1944, the Thunderbolt was about to undergo a remarkable evolution. Its dominance in the air was so complete that it was, in a sense, a victim of its own success. There were simply not enough German planes left to fight, but a machine built to be that tough, that powerful, could not be left idle. American commanders looked at the P-47 with its massive engine, its heavy armor, and its ability to carry a staggering payload, and saw its true destiny. It was not just a fighter. It was a jag bomber, or Jabo, a fighter bomber. It was time for the Thunderbolt to live up to its name and bring the thunder to the ground. The transition was seamless. The P-47 could carry over 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets, a payload comparable to that of a dedicated light bomber from just a few years earlier. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns, which had been so effective against aircraft, proved to be absolutely devastating against ground targets like supply trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. If its toughness was a lifesaver at 20,000 feet, it was even more critical at 200 feet. When flying low-level ground attack missions, a pilot's greatest enemy was not another fighter, but the dense, lethal curtain of anti-aircraft fire, or flak. Here, the P-47's legend was solidified. It could fly through clouds of flak that would shred a Mustang or a Spitfire to pieces. Pilots returned with wings that looked like they had been blasted with a shotgun, with chunks of their control surfaces missing, with their engine cowlings peppered with holes. And still, they returned. They became the terror of the German army on the retreat. A German tank commander knew that the roar of a P-47's engine was often the last thing his crew would ever hear. The Jug had transformed from the guardian of the skies into the wrath of God on the battlefield. The Luftwaffe had been systematically outfought, outthought, and utterly dismantled, not by a faster, more elegant machine, but by a tougher, more resilient one. Kartvel's philosophy of survival had been vindicated on a strategic scale that no one could have ever imagined. The German war machine was crumbling from the air and from the ground, hammered by this unstoppable American juggernaut. But the story was not quite over. The Luftwaffe, battered and broken, would gather its strength for one last, desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. And in that final, fiery confrontation, the P-47 Thunderbolt would provide the ultimate, undeniable proof of its greatness. As the winter of 1944 bled into 1945, the Third Reich was a collapsing star. Hemmed in on all sides, its armies in retreat and its cities in ruins, the Luftwaffe High Command made the decision to stake everything on one final, cataclysmic gamble. The plan was codenamed Operation Bodenplatte Ground Plate. On New Year's Day, 1945, nearly 1,000 German aircraft, scraped together from every last operational unit, were hurled at Allied airfields across Belgium, Holland, and France in a surprise attack designed to cripple Allied air power on the ground. It was the Luftwaffe's death ride, a final, desperate attempt to turn the tide, and it was here, in this massive, chaotic air battle, that the P-47 Thunderbolt would deliver its final, irrefutable closing argument. While Operation Bodenplatte succeeded in destroying hundreds of Allied planes on the ground, the cost in the air was staggering. The German formations, flying low and fast, were met by swarms of Allied fighters, many of whom were already in the air on patrol. Among them were the Thunderbolts, in the wild, swirling dogfights that erupted over the frozen European landscape. The P-47 seconds proved to be more than just durable. They were utterly dominant. When the final tallies of that bloody New Year's Day were counted, the numbers told a story that was almost unbelievable. Allied forces lost around a dozen fighters in the air. The Luftwaffe lost over 200, including a devastating number of their remaining veteran flight leaders. And, in all of that chaos, in the largest single air action fought on the Western Front, it is reported that not a single P-47 Thunderbolt was lost in air-to-air combat. They were to the very bitter end unkillable. This single day was a microcosm of the Thunderbolt's entire career. Its final statistics are not just impressive. They are a testament to Alexander Kartvel's radical vision. Across more than 500,000 sorties flown during World War II, the P-47 suffered a combat loss rate of just 0.7%. To put that in perspective, this was reportedly the lowest loss rate of any major Allied fighter plane. The legendary P-51 Mustang, an aircraft celebrated for its grace and performance, had a loss rate nearly twice as high. For every P-47 lost in combat, its pilots were credited with destroying more than 4 enemy aircraft. It was an exchange ratio that no military strategist could ignore. But the true legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt cannot be measured in kill ratios or statistics written in dusty archives. Numbers can tell you what a machine did, but they can't tell you what it meant. The real story is written in the lives of the men who flew it, and in the families they came home to. The most important number is not the thousands of enemy planes destroyed, but the thousands of American pilots saved. Every P-47 that limped back to base with a dead engine, a shattered tail, or a cockpit riddled with holes was a father who would see his children again, a son who would embrace his mother, a husband who would be reunited with his wife. Kartvel's design philosophy was not just a matter of sound engineering. It was a profoundly humanitarian act, a promise made in steel and rivets to value the life of the warrior above the weapon. And what of the young pilot we met at the beginning of our story, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson? His incredible survival after taking 21 cannon hits was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning. He didn't just return to base. He, recovered from his wounds, climbed back into the cockpit of another P-47 and flew again. The confidence and experience born from that trial by fire transformed him. Robert Johnson would go on to score 27 aerial victories, becoming one of the highest-scoring American aces of the war. His story is the perfect embodiment of the Thunderbolt's strategic genius. By keeping its pilots alive, it allowed them to mature from frightened rookies into seasoned, lethal veterans. The P-47 didn't just win fights. It created the aces who would go on to win the war. Perhaps the most powerful verdict on the Thunderbolt, however, comes not from the victors, but from the vanquished. In the quiet years after the war, when the animosity had faded and former enemies could meet with a shared sense of respect for the brutal craft they had once practiced, the truth was spoken plainly. Adolf Galland, the brilliant and respected general of the German fighter force, was once asked what he considered to be the best American fighter of the war. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. It was not the fast and nimble Mustang that had hounded him in the war's final years. It was, he said, the P-47 Thunderbolt. His reasoning was simple and echoed Kartvel's own philosophy. Because it was the plane that could get the most pilots home. Johannes Steinhoff, the German ace who had once cursed the plane's resilience, would later become a high-ranking general in the new West German Air Force and a close friend to many of his former American adversaries. He, too, admitted that the P-47 was the Allied weapon they had feared the most. They feared it not for its speed or its agility, but for the simple, soul-crushing fact that it brought its pilots back. It gave the Americans an inexhaustible supply of combat-hardened veterans, a luxury the Luftwaffe could only dream of. The very men who had been haunted by the question, "Why won't it fall?" were now providing the final, definitive answer. It wouldn't fall because it was designed not to. It was designed to endure, and in that endurance, it had found the secret to ultimate victory. The war was over, but the echo of the Thunderbolt's philosophy, the lesson that resilience can be the most powerful weapon of all, was only just beginning to be understood. The guns fell silent over Europe, but the lessons forged in the crucible of that conflict continue to echo through the decades. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is more than just a chapter in military history. It is a timeless parable about strength, resilience, and the true definition of performance. The legacy of Alexander Kartvel's audacious design philosophy did not end when the last P-47 was retired from service. It was passed down, a genetic code of survivability, to a new generation of aircraft built to protect their pilots in a new era of warfare. You can see the ghost of the Thunderbolt in the rugged airframe of the F-4 Phantom II, a workhorse of the Vietnam War known for its ability to sustain incredible damage and still bring its crew home. But nowhere is the spirit of the P-47 more alive, more perfectly embodied, than in another aircraft that would bear its legendary name, the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Affectionately known as the Warthog, the A-10 is, in every sense, the spiritual successor to the Jug. It is not fast. It is not beautiful. But it is legendarily tough. It is a flying tank, built around a massive cannon, with a titanium bathtub protecting the pilot and redundant systems designed to withstand the most intense ground fire imaginable. The A-10 was created from the exact same DNA as its World War II ancestor, a testament to the enduring power of an idea that the surest path to victory is to outlast your enemy. The P-47 taught the world a lesson that transcends the battlefield. In our modern culture, we are often obsessed with the metrics of peak performance. We celebrate the fastest car, the slimmest phone, the most efficient algorithm. We are conditioned to believe that better always means faster, lighter, and more optimized. The Thunderbolt stands as a powerful counter-argument to this way of thinking. It is a 7-ton reminder that in the face of chaos and unpredictable adversity, the most important quality is not elegance, but endurance. It teaches us that true strength is not the ability to avoid being hit, but the capacity to take a hit and keep moving forward. This philosophy, prioritizing durability over raw performance, resilience over speed, is not just about engineering. It echoes in every aspect of our lives. It's the entrepreneur who builds a business with a solid foundation, designed to weather economic storms rather than chase fleeting trends. It's the leader who invests in the well-being and loyalty of their team, knowing that a resilient workforce is more valuable than a momentarily brilliant one. It's the individual who understands that personal strength isn't about avoiding failure, but about having the fortitude to get back up after being knocked down, again and again. The world is full of sleek, high-performance machines that shatter at the first sign of trouble. The enduring successes are often the ones built, like the Thunderbolt, over-engineered, a little bit clumsy, but fundamentally unbreakable. The story of the ugly, overweight fighter that nobody wanted is ultimately a story about the triumph of a powerful idea. It's a testament to an immigrant engineer who valued human life above all else, and to the pilots whose unshakable confidence in his creation changed the course of a war. They proved that the ultimate weapon is not always the sharpest, but the one that refuses to break. And so, we want to leave you with a question. The philosophy of the P-47 valuing rugged survivability over peak efficiency is a lesson that can be applied far beyond the skies of wartime Europe. We want to hear your thoughts. In our modern world, in business, technology, or even in our personal lives, where do you think we need a little more of that P-47 philosophy? Which areas of our society would benefit from prioritizing resilience and the ability to endure over the relentless pursuit of speed and short-term performance? Share your ideas and your own stories of resilience in the comments below. We read every one of them. Thank you for joining us on this journey to uncover the story of the machine that taught the world how not to fall.